The mainstream model of evolution requires a myth of origin for humanity, and it has provided several different theories on where we come from. With increasing complexity of their origin myths, it becomes more complicated to present this model in a coherent way. For example, a typical pro-evolutionary argument goes like this, quote, "Most investigation of the ice ages focuses on glaciers, but what about tropical lowlands? During the ice ages, those would have been the most hospitable habitats on Earth. As the glaciers retreated, sea level rose, inundating those habitats and forcing people inland. That would create tremendous population pressure and force coastal people to compete for resources. Those who moved inland would have suffered a terrible fate without sufficient iodine. Most Neanderthal fossils correspond with periods when sea level was high, so they may have been refugees from that coastal competition. Much of the archaeological evidence of early humans probably lies undersea. Even today, Dobson points out, most people live near the sea, which provides ample iodine in the diet. If Neanderthal did suffer an iodine deficiency, either through a dietary dearth or physiological inability to extract it, it would have spread through generations because iodine is very important to fetal development. Babies, although apparently normal at birth, soon develop the large head and bones, curved spine, mental and physical retardation, achy joints, and other infirmities we know as cretinism. Cro-Magnon, living in those same sites, may have been equipped with a more efficient thyroid gland and undoubtedly obtained iodine from some additional source, perhaps by trading with the iodine-rich coast. They were able to outcompete Neanderthal and prosper, but they too suffered from cretinism. One interesting paradox is in the story about human evolution and iodine. Soil is a very poor source of iodine, and most areas on Earth are actually iodine deficient, according to mainstream sources. The only reliable way to get ample amounts of iodine is by consuming seafood. This is why mainstream nutritionists recommend to eat seafood once a week and consume iodized salt. Livestock is being supplemented with large amounts of iodine, or else meat production wouldn't be profitable. For example, pigs are usually fed around 20 times more iodine than humans get. It is well known that iodine is essential for mammals in amounts that are higher than those found offshore or inland. Even today, despite widespread artificial enrichment of the food supply according to WHO data, more than 1 billion people on Earth are chronically iodine deficient and suffer from consequences like goitre and cretinism. One explanation in line with the model of evolution is that mammals originally evolved from the sea and kept the high iodine requirement during the later adaptation. Later, even when they moved inwards into the land, humans kept trade routes with those living near the sea because they understood their own dependence on iodine. But seawater isn't actually a good source of iodine. The only reason seafood is rich in iodine is because algae concentrate the mineral via filtering the water, which then slowly moves up the food chain. I first came across an alternative explanation on iodine and evolution in a paper by iodine researcher Guy Abraham. Quote, "Actually, the oceans are very poor in iodine, based on concentration of this element. Although the largest reservoir of iodine is in the oceans because of their large volume, the concentration of iodate, iodine, iodide in the oceans is only 0.05 parts per million, very dilute indeed, compared to bromide at 70 parts per million. For example, to obtain the RDA, the recommended daily allowance, for iodine from seawater, you need 3 liters. Sea salt is very low in iodide, much lower than iodide in iodized table salt, actually 50 times lower. It is understandable why someone who believes in the theory of evolution has a problem with such high requirements for iodine in an environment depleted of this element. Unless sometimes in the distant past the topsoil of planet Earth contained significant levels of iodine, and meeting these high requirements for iodine sufficiency could then be achieved with any diet. The theory of evolution does not offer an intellectually satisfying answer to this paradox. However, the biblical account of the origin of the world through creation 6,000 years ago, followed by the fall of man and the flood, fits very well the current situation. According to the biblical narrative, the Creator declared planet Earth and everything in it perfect. Therefore, the original planet Earth contained a topsoil rich in iodine and all elements required for perfect health of Adam, Eve, and their descendants. A rebelled archangel was expelled from God's habitation for attempting a hostile takeover. His name was Lucifer before the attempt, Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12, and Satan after his expulsion, Luke chapter 10, verse 18. Satan deceived Eve into believing that she could become a goddess by disobeying her creator, Genesis chapter 3, verse 4 and 5. A sequence of events followed, culminating in the worldwide flood 4,500 years ago. Following this episode, the receding waters washed away the topsoil with all its elements into oceans and seas. The new topsoil became deficient in iodine, and most likely other essential elements, whose essentialities are still unknown. Mountainous areas became the most iodine deficient because the receding waters were the most rapid over the steep slopes, eroding deeper into the soil. The biblical account of the flood fits very well with the finding of high concentrations of iodine in brines, which accompany oil wells and natural gas deposits. By 1977, the brines associated with deposits of natural gas in Japan accounted for 56% of the world iodine production. The previous existence of iodine-rich living organisms, from which came these iodine-rich degradation products, strongly suggests that sometime in the distant past, iodine was plentiful on planet Earth, and some catastrophic event resulted in washing away the iodine-rich topsoil in the oceans. The worldwide flood fits extremely well with the current findings of high iodine concentrations in brines. Dr. Abraham discovered through his research in the Iodine Project that humans need at least 10 to 20 times more iodine than can be found in even the best diets. Only few cultures in the world get enough iodine. From all countries, Japan has the highest average iodine intake per person. Japan also is the country with the most centenarians in the world and the lowest cancer rates. With 48 centenarians for every 100,000 individuals, Japan has the highest rates of centenarians in the world. Looking into the distribution of iodine in the oceans and soil is interesting because water easily washes iodine out of the soil into the sea. Lack of iodine on the land could thus indicate a recent cataclysm that washed large amounts of topsoil into the sea. It is highly likely that this event, known in our cultural memory as the biblical flood, actually created the oceans. If the biblical flood washed essential minerals from the topsoil into the newly created oceans, we should be able to observe the following patterns. The higher you go on Earth, the lower the iodine concentration of the soil. The flood washed soil downwards, so mountain areas would be most affected. The soil would be practically deficient on Earth everywhere, not only in the mountain areas, and the largest absolute percentage of iodine on Earth would be found in the sea. The cataclysm that created the flood also ripped open the ocean crust and created freshwater lakes. In those areas, floodwater from the surrounding areas got washed into newly created soil-free cavities and stayed there. Around those lakes, the iodine content of the soil would be even lower than everywhere else, since the lower parts of Earth that got exposed to the surface do not contain any mineral-rich humus. Due to the deep cavities, the water quickly receded and had no time to evaporate and free the bound minerals again. All of the above is indeed the case. The regions most deficient in iodine are the mountain areas, like in the Andes, as well as the areas around freshwater lakes, like the Great Lakes region. The less topsoil you have, the less iodine. The more deserted an area, the less iodine. Coincidentally, when analyzing the old maps, we see that the iodine-deficient areas like the Great Lakes, the Andes, the Sahara Desert, as well as Lake Baikal were all created only between the 16th and 18th century. This is the time period where I suggest the biblical flood happened and where the oceans got first created. Looking at the historical data on Goitre, it became clear to me that this topic offers us a way to guess when the biblical flood really happened, because the estimation of 6,000 years ago is probably flawed. In reality, it happened during the last 1,000 years. The flood in the Bible. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl, and of cattle, and of beast, every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils were the breath of life. Of all that was in the dry land died, and every living substance was destroyed, which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle, and the creeping things, and the fowl of the heaven, and they were destroyed from the earth. And Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. The creation of Lake Baikal and other deserted areas. Here we see Lake Baikal appears to be a cavity created by a cataclysm that expanded Earth. It appears on the maps only in the 17th century. It seems to be connected to the event that created the Asian deserts south of it. Here we see stretch marks in the sea, probably from the Earth expansion event. Some parts of America appear to be stretched out, just like Asia. When you look at the western part of China, the whole of Middle East, and the western part of America, it certainly looks like stretch marks, similar to what you see in the oceans. This seems to be connected to barren lands and deserts with not much vegetation, just what you expect from deeper parts of the earth that get exposed due to earth expansion. So we are looking at a combination of earth expansion and flooding washing topsoil away. Here is the Great Lakes region today, and on the Ortelius world map of 1570. No Great Lakes visible on the old maps. The floodwater receded into the cavities and washed a lot of nutrients out of the surrounding topsoil. Southern Asia shows signs of earth expansion along the area of the Himalayas. On the right, you see a part of the Mercator world map of 1569. The Himalayas should be north of Delhi and should separate India from a barren wasteland, nowadays Tibet. In these old maps, instead of Tibet, we see rivers and cities, and no clearly visible mountain area that can be compared to the Himalayas. The right map shows part of the Wald-Seemuller map of 1507, and where we would expect Tibet are cities and rivers as well. This part of Asia, north of the Himalayas, looks like it had been ripped open, and it directly lines up with the stretch marks of the ocean to the south. You can follow the line from Inner Asia over the ocean down to Australia. It also looks like Lake Baikal to the north of this barren basin in Inner Asia was created when the earth widened, as well as Lake Balkhash to the west. While both have a dubious ancient history, Lake Baikal was first officially discovered in 1643, and the first recorded mention of Lake Balkhash is in 1644. They are not to be found on older maps. Instead, the region was full of vegetation, small lakes, rivers, and cities until the 17th century. No Lake Baikal, no Lake Balkhash, and no Himalayas on the Ortelius map Theatrum Orbis Terrarum of 1570. It makes sense that the Himalayas are relatively recent as well, and there is no mention of them in ancient history at all. There is no written mention of the Himalayas before the 18th century. In fact, they were only discovered in 1733. In 1733, a French geographer, Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Arville, compiled the first map of Tibet and the Himalayan range based on systematic exploration. In the mid-19th century, the Survey of India organized a systematic program to measure correctly the heights of the Himalayan peaks. The Himalayas aren't on the old maps either. On the above map, the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum from 1570, you see rivers and cities north of Delhi where there should be the barren wastelands of Tibet. In fact, the whole of modern Tibet is probably not older than 400 years. It is breathtaking to rethink the history of our planet according to the maps. There is a reason history is filled with myths. These catastrophic events cut people off of their ancestors to a large extent. We have previously discovered that the Sahara was created during the same time as well. I will summarize that we have a lot of evidence to put the world-altering event that washed away topsoil everywhere in the world into the time frame between 1500 and 1800. The history of goitre and cretinism in remote mountain people. Goitre as an example of degeneration due to the inability of humans to adapt to the post-flood world with its change in mineral composition of the soil, as well as abrupt change in climate and sun activity. First, we need to understand when the concept of goitre and cretinism, most well-known symptoms of extreme iodine deficiency and associated with loss of intelligence, first popped up in our culture. This will give us a good understanding of the time frame of the flooding of the earth, since goitre and cretinism would be the first result of societies who are confronted with a sudden change in iodine levels in the local soil. While there are mentions of goitre from before the 19th century, the term itself was popularized around 1835 in the medical field, and it seems society started to observe the issue starting in the 18th century. Given the fact that written literature always lags behind real life, we can assume that goitre became a widespread problem starting around 1700. Starting with the early 19th century, we are seeing the first scientific explorations of remote mountain villagers. In some areas of the world, entire villages, for example in Switzerland, were degenerating, and almost everyone had goitre, and many children were born cretins. Understandably, the term cretin is older than the term goitre, since the latter was mostly connected to a medical diagnosis, while the former started as a pejorative swear word in the late 17th. It is derived from crétine, French for alluvium, meaning soil deposited by flowing water, a perfect description of the flood. The question of endemic goitre cropped up again and again. We have already seen that Felix Plater referred to cretinism in his native Valais, but Paracelsus, Munster, Lang, Stumpf, and Campbell had also referred to it. After Plater, there was the only book by Wolfgang Hofer, Hercules Medicus Sive Locuum Communium Liber, published Vienna 1657, which discussed the cause of goitre by air, water, and food. Dr. Edward Brown was the eldest son of Sir Thomas Brown, a physician in Norwich, who was the author of Religio Medici. Edward Brown had studied in Cambridge and at Oxford, became a Fellow of the Royal Society, a president of the College of Physicians, and was on the staff of St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London. He became especially known when he described his extensive travels in Europe in the 1660s. Of particular interest in his account of his travels to Vienna and from there to Hungary and other parts of the Austrian Empire. In the Styrian Alps, he noted, "In these districts there are many Goitrous people. Many here have great throats, some as big as their heads. Many are blind, others dumb, and fools withal. Without the town there is an hospital for such as have lost their voice, their wits, or are otherwise oppressed by their great throats. The better sort of people which live well, drink wine and good beer, are less subject to them. I saw bigger throats in these parts than any I have observed in the alpine part of Savoy. In the Valais of Switzerland, cretin has been the word used for centuries, to denote goitrous, dwarfed, deaf and dumb unfortunates, who occurred there more often than in other places. In the valley of the Aosta, Piedmont, such human beings were lumped together with the insane, all being called pazzi. In the report of a royal commission on cretinism in the kingdom of Sardinia in 1848, the incidence of cretinism in the Aosta Valley was put as high as 28%. In his major work Des maladies mentales, Paris 1838, Jean-Étienne Dominique Esquirol advanced yet another theory on the derivation of crétin. Might not the denomination crétin come from the obsolete word crétine, which has the same meaning as alluvium? Has not this name been transferred to individuals who have become infirm in consequence of having dwelt upon an alluvial soil?" End quote. If the date of the travels of Edward Browne in the 1660s are correct, we can place the flood that washed the soil into the sea and caused the widespread condition of iodine deficiency into the time around 1600 or earlier. Sadly, many of the earliest books were backdated after publication, so we can't be sure on that one. Only by the 19th century do publications on goitre become common. The previous reference to goitre by people like Paracelsus are unfortunately very opaque and don't help us when it comes to discovering the time of the flood. It took Switzerland until 1922 to fortify their salt with iodine, which quickly eliminated the extreme cases of iodine deficiency. In the early 20th century, a dentist named Weston Price visited the remains of traditional cultures on Earth to study their health and its relation to diet. An excerpt from his book Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, 1939, "In Africa, I found many tribes gathering certain plants from swamps and marshes and streams, particularly the water hyacinth. These plants were dried and burned for their ashes, which were put into the foods of mothers and growing children. A species of water hyacinth is shown in figure 130. The woman shown in figure 130, with an enormous goitre, had come down from a 9,000-foot level in the mountains above Lake Edward. Here all the drinking water was snow water, which did not carry iodine. She had come down from the high area to the 6,000-foot level to gather the water hyacinth and other plants to obtain the ashes from these and other iodine-carrying plants, to carry back to her children to prevent, as she explained, the formation of big neck, such as she had. The people living at the 6,000-foot level also used the ashes of these plants." As a summary, we can conclude that the symptoms of widespread iodine deficiency only began to get culturally observed, according to relatively reliable written sources, starting with the 17th century. Only by the mid-19th century, around 200 years later, the condition was understood well enough to understand the actual cause of goitre, iodine deficiency. It was shortly afterwards that iodine supplements became wildly popular. Some tribes and cultures were able to understand the connection between goitre and foods in the post-Diluvian times, like the cited African tribe, while others were completely clueless, for example, the one in Switzerland. We see a lack of knowledge, and those cultures that understood the connection probably rediscovered it by accident. What we see here with the lack of knowledge about human nature, biology, and medicine is the consequence of a traumatic cataclysm that wiped out the foundation of human life itself in many areas of the world. Consistent with the flood theory of iodine deficiency in soils, the alpine regions of Switzerland became a hotspot of cretinism and goitre, and it seems in the 19th century almost entire populations were affected. This implies the question, how long can a group of people breed and create offspring instead of simply going extinct when 30% of the population are already affected by cretinism? If the Aosta Valley in Switzerland is a representative example, by mid-19th century, the population was already degenerated to a point where it could not survive without outside help at all. How many generations after the flood had created the iodine-deficient conditions in the alpine regions of Switzerland does it take to reach a cretinism rate of 30%? How many generations can a group of people sustain itself under such conditions? I would think not more than 200 years, since reproduction is impossible with extreme iodine deficiency. So in my view, this is one of the best indications that the world-altering flooding event happened very recently. My guess would be in around 1700. The speed of distribution of iodine and the last ice age. According to the paper, The Origin of Iodine in Soil, Part 2, Iodine in Soils of Germany, by Schnell et al. In the journal Chemie der Erde, Volume 59, it only takes around 1,238 years for the current concentration of iodine in German soil to be deposited by rain. In other words, if the iodine concentration of the soil was 0 1,238 years ago, it would have taken the last 1,000 years to reach the current concentration via rainfall alone, since rainfall is the primary way soils accumulate iodine. Since the scientists measured the iodine concentration on multiple locations with different iodine levels, they arrived at an average time of 1,238 years to fill up the iodine inventories, but most of the locations indicate that it has taken no more than 1,000 years to fill up the soil with iodine, since we can assume that the soil was not 100% iodine-free after the flood. The calculated time period is between 722 and 2,146 years, with an average value of 1,238 years. Thus, it takes between 723 and 2,146 years to bring the iodine content of the top 60 centimeters of soil in Germany from 0 to the present value. Smith and White, 1981, estimate from the widely ranging results in the literature that about 15% of iodine is passing directly into rivers and groundwater, and 85% is taken up by the soil solid. If 50% only of the deposited iodine is retained in the top 60 centimeter layer, the time periods, of course, would be doubled. Goldschmidt, 1954, suggested that areas covered by Pleistocene glaciation have lower iodine concentrations due to the original soil cover removed by glacial action. The new soil, formed by glacial processes, would be low in iodine, a factor often cited in discussion of the occurrence of endemic goitre. In the study, the scientists measured the iodine concentration in rainfall and compared it to the actual iodine concentration in the soil in different German areas. From the available data, they concluded that if the glaciers in the last ice age had washed all the iodine into the sea 10,000 years ago, it would have only taken on average 1,238 years for the iodine concentration to normalize again. It is the only study that actually measures rain iodine levels in relation to soil iodine. However, there is one big flaw with the interpretation of the raw data. It operates in the context that the Ice Age ended roughly 10,000 years ago, and that the iodine concentrations were zero shortly after the Ice Age was over, when the glaciers melted and the soil was washed into the sea. In light with the other evidence I have provided, the rain distribution of iodine as provided by this study shows that it only takes a couple hundred years for extremely iodine-deficient soils to concentrate the current amounts of iodine. In other words, the low concentrations of iodine in the soils around the world indicate that the flood happened only a couple hundred years ago, and we are still in the process where an equilibrium between rain iodine and soil iodine has to be reached. This is supported by the fact that iodine concentrations in soils still differ wildly, even in the same country. For example, in the above study, there's a 300% difference in concentration of iodine in the soils between the 5 locations given, as we can see in this chart. Since over a long enough period of time, rainfall should create an equilibrium of iodine in the soil. This supports the idea that the flood happened relatively recently. If the low concentrations of iodine in the above study were the result of the last ice age 10,000 years ago, we would see higher iodine concentration in the soil today. The back-calculated length of time to fill up the iodine inventories is actually a good indicator of the maximum amount of time passed since the flood. The study thus sets an upper limit. Given uniform rainfall, we can say that the flood happened during the last 723 years. Otherwise, the area at Humtrup, Westerland would have way higher iodine levels in the soil. Assuming that the flood did not wash 100% of the iodine in Humtrup into the sea, we can assume that post-flood the concentration of iodine was greater than zero. For example, if the Humtrup iodine concentration post-flood was 50 times 10 to the minus 2, the flood would have happened around 350 years ago. To get a better understanding of the date of the flood, we would need to find soil with the lowest amount of iodine and compare it with the average iodine deposition from rainfall. Unfortunately, the data from Humtrup is the closest we have. There are other signs that the iodine content of land regions has been steadily increasing during the last decades due to rainfall, which is in contrast to the hypothesis that it took 10,000 years for the current equilibrium to be reached. Not only that, recent studies indicate that the deposition of iodine into the inland areas is actually increasing in an unexpected rate, calling into question the hypothesis that it takes thousands of years for iodine to be deposited into the inland areas. During the last 70 years alone, the iodine concentration of the remote alpine regions at least tripled. Here we use seasonally resolved records from an alpine ice core to investigate 20th century changes in atmospheric iodine. After carefully considering possible post-depositional changes in the ice core record, we conclude that iodine deposition over the Alps increased by at least a factor of 3 from 1950 to the 1990s in the summer months, with smaller increases during the winter months. Of course, the scientists actually blame this sudden increase on anthropogenic climate change. But in my view, these numbers indicate that the iodine concentrations on Earth are rapidly changing in favor of more iodine in land areas, since the high concentration of iodine in the sea compared to the land is unnatural and not in equilibrium. Since iodine is a volatile halogen, it is expected to get transported from sea into land easily. The iodine craze of the 19th century and Big Pharma. The 19th century saw an explosion in scientific knowledge, and by 1829, a French doctor named Jean Lugol had created a liquid solution of iodine for medical use. With the increased knowledge about mineral deficiencies and disease, a hype began to form around certain health products. Lugol's iodine is a good example, as well as American Lithia water, which contained high doses of lithium, a psychoactive mineral. Lugol's iodine became the universal antibiotic of the 19th century and saved countless lives. It took 100 years to make people forget this, and with the discovery of semi-synthetic and synthetic antibiotics, the powers that be slowly but steadily oppressed the old methods of healing disease. Both Lugol's iodine and Lithia water got badmouthed and buried. Some 50 years ago, Nobel laureate Albert Gent-Giorgi, the physician who discovered vitamin C in 1928 and who was a medical student in the early 1900s, wrote, "When I was a medical student, iodine, in the form of potassium iodide, was the universal medicine. Nobody knew what it did, but it did something, and it did something good. We students used to sum up the situation in this little rhyme: if you don't know where, what, and why, prescribe ye then K and I." Our medical predecessors, possessing very few and crude instruments only, had to make use of two given by nature, the use of which has since gone out of fashion: eyes and brains. They were keen observers, and the universal application of iodide might have been not without foundation. Phenomenal growth of iodine-containing products, from 10 preparations listed in the pharmacopoeias in 1851 to 1,700 approved pharmacopoeial names assigned to iodine-containing products in 1956, is compelling evidence for the widespread applications of iodine in medicine. In the Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park in May 1851, iodine and iodine compounds were publicly shown for the first time by 10 pharmaceutical firms. By 1890, to choose a date at random, the 6th edition of Martindale's Extra Pharmacopoeia sponsored 30 medicaments derived from iodine. The Iodine Centenary volume, compiled by the prescriber in 1914, mentions 45 iodine preparations. By 1928, Martindale had extended its coverage to 128 iodine items, and, in an international index published in 1956 and devoted exclusively to iodine pharmaceuticals, no less than 1,700 approved pharmacopoeial names, proprietary names, synonyms, and alternative designations are alphabetically listed. By the early 1900s, iodine was well established in medical and surgical practices, as described in the Encyclopaedia Britannica, 11th edition, published in 1910-1911. Nowadays, we only get enough iodine to prevent the most acute deficiency syndromes, but not enough to actually thrive. Only people in very few areas of the world get enough iodine. For example, those living on traditional Japanese diet, or people living on the Spanish coast with a diet high in shellfish. Coincidentally, both Japanese and Spanish are among those countries with the highest life expectancy in the world. Many animals go to great length at satisfying their iodine requirements, like the bonobos. Here we see an adult female bonobo retrieving water lilies from a backwater. The history of the use of iodine in medicine as a universal antibiotic and health-promoting substance shortly after its discovery, and the subsequent suppression 100 years later by the medical establishment, shows that humans naturally understand the world around them, but that there are powerful forces in our world that don't want us to go back into a state of abundance and health. The history of goitre, cretinism, and the discovery of their connection to iodine also gives us a clue about when the flooding event that changed the mineral composition of the soil really happened. Once confronted by a problem, humans either go extinct or look for solutions. Fight and flight response. Modern medicine is rooted in this search for solutions and for understanding of the post-flood world, but this has been forgotten. By the end of the 19th century, people had already figured out many parts of the puzzle. After the flooding of Earth, many things changed, including the mineral composition of the soil, but also probably the climate and the activity of the sun. Thus, we are actually living in a world where we don't really fit in. This is not the world that was created for us, and the abrupt changes after the last worldwide cataclysm give a better understanding into why infectious and degenerative diseases have increased exponentially during the last 300 years. While most researchers try to frame everything within the context of slow evolution, a closer look reveals that the model of evolution is full of contradictions and is only used as a tool to suppress our true history and our true destiny. Metals, alchemy, and the quest for eternal life. Why were the alchemists of old obsessed with metals? Were metals only used as a metaphor for the transmutation of the human soul, or did they know something we don't? When looking into nutrition, it quickly becomes obvious that minerals have an intimate connection to different mental states, and thus it would be no surprise if our ancestors had a detailed map of the relationship between metals, minerals, and the body, psyche, soul. For example, when humans began to experiment with metals that were never part of the Earth's soil, for we artificially extracted them from deep mines, like mercury, they quickly realized that it's turning people into zombies. Mad as a hatter is a colloquial English phrase used in conversation to suggest, lightheartedly, that a person is suffering from insanity. It is believed to emanate from Luton, Bedfordshire, in eastern England, where men in the area worked predominantly in the hattery business, which used mercury in the hat-making process. The accumulation of mercury in the body causes symptoms similar to madness. The earliest known appearance of the phrase in print is in an 1829 issue of Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine. Interestingly, mercury is one of the most important metals in alchemy, and there are some who say that mercury was used as the primary ingredient for the free energy technology powering the old houses, which appears to be contradictory. If the old world was powered by mercury, how can it be so toxic? It has been noted that mercury exerts its negative effect via replacing essential metals in the body, thus maybe starting a misdirected process of alchemical transformation and transmutation, for example, by blocking the connection between the body and the chakras. Another interesting mineral is copper. The world of antiquity was a world of copper roofs. The ancient buildings were all created with very durable copper roofs, as we see here. According to some experiments, these roofs can last up to 1,000 years without any repair. Rainfall washes some of that copper from the roofs into the soil, thereby nourishing the plants and creating an antibiotic and health-promoting effect. The use of copper in antiquity was widespread. For example, People primarily used cookware made out of copper, thus their food was very high in copper as well. Additionally, copper tools were buried into the soil. They picked a relatively simple eye salve, calling for garlic, onions, and cow bile to be mixed with wine and aged in a copper vessel. Modern technology tries to replicate this antimicrobial effect. The shell of the tram is made from dark wood and tinted glass, while the handrails are made of antimicrobial copper. Some even speculate that humans pre-flood were running on copper instead of iron for oxygen transport in the blood. On the other hand, an excess of copper is associated with mental disease. See the article by Deb Tokars. Either way, it becomes obvious that metals are central to the functions of the human body, especially the nervous system and the psyche, and thus metals are one of the most important factors that control the interplay between the soul, the chakras, and the human body. Conclusion. Dr. Abraham, with his Iodine project, showed that many health problems can be corrected simply by taking large amounts of iodine. People report a sense of well-being and feeling alive for the first time. Maybe he had discovered a part of the old alchemical knowledge that had been lost after the flood. The old esoteric traditions speak about a primordial enemy of mankind and his desire to undermine our spiritual evolution. It is said that we have around us an energy body that protects us. The only way to attack us would be via weakening this energy body. There are many ways to do this. We have a predator that came from the depths of the cosmos and took over the rule of our lives. Human beings are its prisoners. The predator is our Lord and Master. It has rendered us docile, helpless. If we want to protest, it suppresses our protest. If we want to act independently, it demands that we don't do so. I have been beating around the bush all this time, insinuating to you that something is holding us prisoner. Indeed, we are held prisoner. This was an energetic fact for the sorcerers of ancient Mexico. They took us over because we are food for them, and they squeeze us mercilessly because we are their sustenance. Just as we rear chickens in chicken coops, the predators rear us in human coops, humaneros. Therefore, their food is always available to them. Carlos Castaneda. Then there was the mystic G.I. Gurdjieff, who proposed the idea that humanity is food for the moon. The moon is actually a fragment of this earth, which must now constantly maintain the moon's existence. Everything living on the earth, people, animals, plants, is food for the moon. The moon is a huge living being feeding upon all that lives and grows on the earth. Before iodine-deficient people were called cretins, the older word used was lunatic, and people back then understood that everything dark, evil, and negative came from the moon. The moon plays a role in alchemy as well, being connected to the element silver. It is interesting to note that the planetary metals in alchemy are mostly toxic per our modern understanding: mercury, silver, lead, etc., while the mundane metals are those that actually promote health: zinc, magnesium, sulfur, etc. Maybe alchemy was an attempt to understand the metals that are connected to our dark side and to reduce the influence of those powers over our lives. The sole purpose of planets in the sky might be in keeping humanity asleep under the influence of planetary metals like mercury, tin, lead, etc. Flood has to be seen in a broader context, where our world was changed in a way as to cause the actual fall of mankind. With the connections of our chakras to our nervous system blocked, we have lost the ability to easily connect to the godly energies, the upper world, the sun energy. Framing things more positively, The cataclysm that triggered the flood catapulted humanity into darkness, and this was probably no accident. The journey of humanity and the fall are closely connected. The fall and subsequent awakening is an important process in spiritual growth. It's a journey into the underworld where we are being confronted with a dark side of ourselves. The true process of transformation can only be understood when looking at humanity as a whole. The post-flood dark ages represent a part that was always within us. If it was always within us, the only way to overcome it is to go through it.